So, if I understand, Julio, you wanted me to tell you something about the archives of MRI, and they go back probably to before MRI began, which was March 4th, 1959. And how could it be before? Because the Bateson team, which was Bateson and Haley, John Weakland, J. Haley, and Don Jackson was a psychiatrist at the VA who was consulting to their project. And that's the group, Bateson, Jackson, Weakland, and Haley, who wrote the original double-bind paper, which was the double-bind as a theory of schizophrenia, which has proven problematic as a theory of schizophrenia, but a very stimulating paper in terms of people's interest in how psychological pressures can arise from double binds. It's now been well understood that double binds are much more omnipresent, ubiquitous than had been originally thought. In those early days, we had 16 millimeter film, and there was an interesting episode in which Don Jackson had been presented in his consultant role with a patient, and he was told by the Bateson team that the patient was particularly interesting because he had the delusion that he was a psychologist. And this was a new psychologist at the VA who hadn't really gotten to know Don Jackson. And the psychologist was told that he would be seeing a particularly interesting patient because this patient had the delusion that he was a psychiatrist. And a 16 millimeter film was made of this episode. When the Brief Therapy Center was formed, which was in about 1966, we used to function out of a church on Bryant Street. I'm motioning in the right direction. And we had a huge tape recorder given to us by the chairman of our board. His name was Richard Elkis, and he was the president or CEO maybe of the Ampex Corporation, which I believe made Memorex tapes. And this machine was this long, this wide, and this high, and it weighed probably 125 pounds. And it recorded 2-inch wide videotapes on reels that much in diameter. Now there are maybe one or two in the whole United States which are in proper working order. So the earliest tapes at the Brief Therapy Center were recorded on 2-inch wide videotape. Then, of course, we saw it go to 1-inch, then 3/4 inch, and then VHS, and now I don't even know whether they're using VHS or just a digital card. So the contents of the archives consist of many things. We do not include in the archives the recordings of sessions done in the Brief Therapy Center. We have lots and lots of 7-inch reel-to-reel recordings of, skipping anything clinical that we don't have. We got signed consents at the time, but nobody knows where they are now. But we've had many, many conferences, sometimes at hotels in San Francisco, sometimes just sound recordings, sometimes video recordings. of various workshops. So we have conferences, workshops, guest presentations at staff meetings. In 1966, I think it might have been, I invited Don Jackson, Virginia Satir, and Paul Václavic to join me in each giving a presentation at the California Psychological Association. Let me also share with you some of my recollections of the early days here at MRI, but I can't share them of the earliest stage because I was not here at its founding. I came in the summer of 1963 to do an internship at the Palo Alto VA hospital, and I left one day a week free to volunteer some time at MRI. I heard that their staff meetings were on Wednesday, so I kept my Wednesdays free. And at that time I met Don Jackson, Gregory Bates, and Paul Václavic, John Wakeman, Dick Fish. There was a psychiatrist named Jerry Rose, and whom did I leave out? Did I mention Jay Haley, John Weekland? Anyway, it was interesting seeing how the staff functioned. Jay Haley, in the early days, would sit in a staff meeting, and the staff would be in a room with chairs drawn around in a kind of a circle. And sometimes he would swivel around with his back to the rest of the group, put his feet up on the radiator, and you knew he was awake because if something amused him, he would go. Paul Václavic had a part of the structured family interview which he thought could be quantified, and I volunteered to do that. And what it was basically was that each member of the family would be arrayed around a table, and the therapist would say, I'd like you each, and he'd hand out 3x5 cards, I'd like you each to write down the worst fault of the person on your left. And he said, I'm going to write 2 cards also and put them in. And then he would pass these around, and it would be the job of the group as he would read these to say, to whom does this apply most? And the 2 that the therapist put in always were the same. This person's worst fault is that he or she is too good, or that this person's worst fault is that he or she is too strong. And my quantification of the data we had on many families showed to a statistically significant degree that the identified patient, the supposed sick person, guessed more accurately than anybody else. My interpretation of that was that the identified patient was allowed to be the truth teller because everybody knows he's crazy anyway. You don't have to pay any attention to what he says.
Well,
there was other work done by Winter, who was a psychologist in San Jose, and Tony Ferreira was a psychiatrist from San Jose, and they had a rubber stamp made which was like the Tikura flag, and they gave everybody a box of crayons, and they had to color in the flags. And the job of each person in the family was to guess who drew this flag with these colors. Once again, in their work, the identified patient was the most accurate at guessing who, and to a statistically significant degree, which is quite surprising because there's no rational reason I can think of why anybody should be able to guess beyond chance. But That was true. We also had in the early days a man, psychiatrist named William Fry. And William F. Fry wrote a book called Sweet Laughter, and I think he wrote Keep 'Em Laughing. He wrote several books about humor. He was one of the early believers that laughter is very good for a person physiologically and in terms of being a mood elevator. In those days, nobody knew anything about endorphins, but there was the still earlier precedent for this. Norman Cousins, who was editor of the Saturday Review, had gotten cancer, and during his long recuperative period, he made it a point to read a lot of humor things, and he wrote a book about his recovery in which he attributed some of it to the fact that he kept himself in a good mood by reading funny things. So that was in maybe the late 1950s, early 60s, something like that. But anyway, William Fry was and still is a leader in this. He still writes on this subject. Jerry Rose was a psychiatrist. He was doing a session of family therapy behind a one-way mirror at our old address, which was 777 Bryant Street. And he was seeing a couple who had a child, about a 10-year-old boy, who would have an asthma attack every time the couple began to argue. And I think what he noticed was that, of course, the couple would stop arguing right away to attend to their poor, suffering child. So he said to them, "Look, I am a physician. I have a little pen here with some epi in it, and I will look after your son if he gets an asthmatic attack, but I don't want you to allow that to interrupt your argument. Please keep arguing. I'll take care of your son." So it wasn't exactly prescribing the symptom. It was telling the parents, don't let the symptom serve its previous function of interrupting your arguing, which is upsetting to your son. So that was a very interesting and concrete illustration of the idea of systemic thinking. Much of the family therapy being done and taught here was connected with how people communicated. And I don't mean just within the family, I also mean the therapist's communication. I'll give you an interesting example. Don Jackson came into a first session with a mother and a father and a boy who he'd been told was a juvenile delinquent. As Don Jackson walks into the room and sits down, he says to the delinquent, "So you're the alleged delinquent," thus instantly displaying skepticism and beginning the process of unlabeling this kid. One of the things that Don Jackson used to say was that, he'd been a trained psychoanalyst, that in family therapy you don't need to rely as you might in the original psychoanalytic methodology. You don't need to rely on the analysis of the transference neurosis. You don't need to depend on that because the significant others are right in the room. They do not have to be projected upon the therapist acting as a blank screen. He doesn't have to infer from how the patients are making him feel. He sees the interaction. The real people are right there. Now, that's not always true of parents, but you get his general point. Another thing that Don Jackson used to point out is that Resistance is a word coined by therapists to blame the patient for the therapist's lack of any concrete knowledge about how to instigate change. When I was doing the evaluation of the family therapy training program, I wrote up, among other things, a number of training issues which I had identified, such as, at that time, most of the psychotherapy training in both psychology and psychiatry programs began with individual therapy, and I raised the question, why must it be all individual therapy and then maybe as an afterthought tack on a little group therapy or family or couple therapy? Maybe there should be both all along, not to give primacy of one over the other. I could think of a possible answer to that, namely that it's more complicated dealing with a group or dealing with a traditioned group, as the sociologists call a family. That means a group with a shared past and an expectation of a continued future, where the members of the group share mutual control over one another's social reinforcement schedules. In any case, I framed a lot of these questions in terms of the balance and the sequencing between this and that approach to training. And I asked Jay Haley to look it over, and he rewrote all of my questions as this versus that, which I think shows he had a more confrontative, provocative stance. And I remember one time he was invited to give a lecture at Mount Zion Hospital psychiatric training program, and the residents loved his talk. It was a breath of fresh air, but he was stirring up lots of challenges to the concepts they were being taught. My style was a little bit different, and by the way, the professors are the ones who have the power to invite him back, and if you challenge that which has made the professors secure and well known, they're not as likely to invite you back. My style was to say that what you've learned so far can be a very good foundation, but can you now make some room for an additional set of concepts? Because I never quite agreed with something that Paul Watzlawick used to say a lot. He didn't have much respect for the concept of eclecticism. He thought it was a sort of a mealy-mouthed refusal to choose a position and make it your own. And the training of psychologists in this country tends to be, not in all instances, but an exposure to many approaches to therapy, and some approaches fit the personality of some therapists better than other approaches. For example, if you try to use humor in therapy and you're not a very funny person, it's going to fall flat. By the way, if you are a very funny person, I still caution you about the use of humor. Be careful about using it in any way that could be correctly or mistakenly interpreted as sarcasm with anyone. And people who seem like they have borderline personality disorder may not take well to humor. They may think you're mocking them. So be careful with humor. I think I'm going to stop now because I've said a little bit in introduction, but maybe I'll also say one more thing, that in the Brief Therapy Center, we used systemic thinking, communicational thinking, um, strategic thinking. Jay Haley had gone, borrowing my little tape recorder, to visit Milton Erickson for a week or 10 days, and he made a whole bunch of little cassette recordings of his interviews with Milton Erickson, from which came the book by Jay, Uncommon Therapy. And Jay also was the editor of a 3-volume collected papers of Milton Erickson. So what I'm pointing out is that there wasn't a communicational school of thought, a brief school of thought, a structural school of thought, a strategic school of thought. They were all mixed together in the work of the Brief Therapy Center. It was communicational, it was systemic, it was strategic. I will say that the one thing that I believe all family therapists agree on, and we had this discussion at the American Psychological Association's Division of Family Psychology, as it was then called, was that there was a systemic element. Not everybody agrees that there's a strategic element, or not everybody agrees in the brevity principle, but all family therapists try to think systemically, or do automatically think systemically. But certainly from the beginning of the Brief Therapy Center, there was also that communicational and strategic, and to some extent structural aspect. These things were not separate. I think later some people, wanting to establish their own turf and become famous for something with their brand on it, began to call it this type and that type. But being an old-timer, I'm not so enamored of these claims of purity and this is distinctive from the other types. Although I don't like the way Mao used it in China, I do think that 1,000 flowers can bloom.